While Washington sleeps, Beijing is rewriting the rules of power in America's backyard. No tanks, no troops, just trade, tech, and a strategy so quiet you never saw it coming. This is the story of an empire built in silence. The world barely blinked when China released its latest policy document on Latin America and the Caribbean. No primetime coverage, no emergency United Nations sessions. Just another bureaucratic update filed away in the footnotes of international news. But that silence? That's the entire strategy, because what's unfolding across Latin America isn't a loud conquest. It's a methodical rewiring of influence, power, and dependency that operates below the radar of traditional geopolitics. Beijing isn't trying to dominate headlines anymore. It's embedding itself into the economic bloodstream of an entire hemisphere. And by the time most people notice, the operation will already be complete. This isn't about loans that make the front page or infrastructure projects politicians can cut ribbons on. That era is over. What's replacing it is far more sophisticated, far more durable, and far harder to reverse. China is no longer asking Latin American countries to pick sides. It's building the systems that make choosing anyone else economically painful. To understand how we got here, you need to rewind to a time when China's playbook in the region looked very different. The old playbook: big money, big risk, big failure. A little over a decade ago, China's strategy in Latin America was impossible to miss. Massive loans, state-owned banks pouring billions into ambitious national projects, highways, dams, railways, energy plants. In 2010 alone, Chinese development banks funneled close to $25 billion into the region. It was a flood of capital designed to buy goodwill, secure resources, and announce China's arrival as a global power player. The model was simple: lend big, build big, and lock in influence through debt. But it didn't work. Between 2005 and the late 2010s, nearly half of all Chinese development finance in Latin America went to one country, Venezuela. Beijing bet heavily on the Chavez and Maduro governments, extending tens of billions in credit backed by future oil shipments. On paper, it made sense. Venezuela had the world's largest proven oil reserves. China needed energy security. It seemed like a win-win. Except Venezuela's economy collapsed. Oil production plummeted, debt payments stalled, and China found itself holding loans it couldn't collect on and political relationships that had become liabilities rather than assets. The lesson was clear. Lending massive sums to politically unstable governments is not a sustainable strategy. So Beijing pivoted. By 2023, Chinese development lending to Latin America had shrunk to just over $1.3 billion. That year, only 2 new loans were issued, both to Brazil. Compare that to the flood of capital a decade earlier, and it looks like China has lost interest. But that's the wrong conclusion. China hasn't withdrawn. It's gotten smarter. The volume of money has dropped, yes, but the targeting has become laser-focused. Beijing is no longer trying to finance entire governments. It's selecting specific projects, specific sectors, and specific countries that align with long-term strategic goals. The loans that do go out now come with stricter terms, clearer commercial justifications, and tighter risk controls. Meanwhile, Chinese state banks have been redirected inward, tasked with stabilizing domestic growth rather than chasing influence abroad. Overseas lending is no longer justified by symbolic gestures. It has to pay off, literally and strategically. What looks like retreat is actually recalibration, and while the money slowed down, something else picked up speed: trade. The new engine: trade as the foundation of influence. In 2024, total trade between China and Latin America hit $518.5 billion. That's a 6% increase from the year before. And it's not a blip. It's part of a structural shift that has been building for years. China is now Latin America's second largest trading partner, and in some countries, it's the first. More importantly, the nature of that trade creates dependencies that run far deeper than any loan ever could. Let's start with minerals. China accounts for roughly one-third of all mineral exports from Latin America. Copper from Chile and Peru, iron ore from Brazil. These aren't luxury goods. They're the raw materials that feed China's industrial machine. Then there's agriculture. About 75% of China's soybean imports come from Latin America. Brazil and Argentina have become essential suppliers to a country that feeds 1.4 billion people. If that pipeline shuts down, China's food security is in jeopardy. If demand drops, entire rural economies in South America collapse. But the most strategic dependency is in lithium. In 2024, nearly 98% of China's lithium carbonate imports came from Latin America. Lithium is the core ingredient in batteries for electric vehicles, smartphones, grid storage, and the entire clean energy transition. Without it, China's ambitions in green technology stall. With it, Beijing controls a choke point in the global economy. This isn't just trade, it's strategic entanglement, and it works both ways. Latin American countries now depend on Chinese demand to keep their export economies running. China depends on Latin America for resources it can't easily source elsewhere. The result is a relationship that doesn't need formal treaties or political alignment. It sustains itself through mutual necessity. Here's where it gets even more interesting. While imports from China grow, exports from China to the region are exploding. Between 2023 and 2024, Chinese exports to Latin America jumped 13%. Electric vehicle exports alone surged 55% in 2023, reaching $4.2 billion. If United States trade barriers against Chinese goods continue to tighten, even more of that export flow will be redirected south. Latin America becomes both a supplier and a market, a dual role that deepens integration with every shipment. This is influence without spectacle. No grand ceremonies, no flags and handshakes, just cargo ships, trade agreements, and supply chains that bind economies together in ways that outlast any political administration. Once trade becomes this embedded, the question is no longer who gives you money. It's who controls the systems your economy depends on. The invisible shift from concrete to code. For years, when people thought about Chinese investment in Latin America, they pictured dams, highways, and ports, big visible infrastructure that could be photographed, criticized, or celebrated. That image is outdated. By 2022, roughly 58% of Chinese foreign direct investment in Latin America was flowing into what's called new infrastructure. Digital networks, renewable energy, electric vehicle production, advanced manufacturing. Over 60% of Chinese investment deals now target sectors that didn't even exist in the region's strategic planning a decade ago. This is a move up the value chain, and it changes everything. In Brazil and Mexico, Chinese companies are building electric vehicle and battery manufacturing plants. These aren't just factories. They're nodes in a production network that connects directly back to China's industrial ecosystem. In Chile, Chinese firms are expanding lithium processing capacity. Instead of shipping raw materials abroad and importing finished batteries, the value chain is being built locally, with Chinese technology at its core. Across Argentina and Chile, solar energy projects and power transmission systems are being deployed using Chinese equipment. These aren't one-off installations. They set technical standards that will shape energy infrastructure for decades. In major cities, Chinese telecommunications companies are supplying 5G networks, cloud infrastructure, and smart city systems. These aren't consumer products. They're the backbone of modern governance, commerce, and daily life. Here's the crucial point. Infrastructure is never neutral, and it's never temporary. When a country builds its digital networks on Chinese technology, switching providers later isn't a simple procurement decision. It's a systemic overhaul. Data systems, interoperability standards, technical training, regulatory frameworks, all of it is tied to the original platform. The same applies to energy grids, manufacturing systems, and transportation networks. Once they're built around Chinese standards and equipment, changing direction becomes prohibitively expensive and operationally disruptive. This is where China's strategy has evolved from visible to invisible. Beijing is no longer interested in projects that make headlines. It's embedding itself inside the operational core of national economies. And when systems start working in sync, influence doesn't need to be enforced. It becomes automatic. China's political approach in Latin America is just as methodical as its economic one. And, it operates on a principle that Washington has consistently struggled to grasp. Consistency beats intensity. Beijing has one absolute requirement: acknowledgement of the One China principle. Taiwan cannot be recognized as independent. That's non-negotiable. Beyond that, well, Beijing doesn't care what your ideology is. Progressive governments, conservative coalitions, populist movements, technocratic administrations, China engages them all the same way. There are no lectures about democracy, no human rights conditions, no demands for political reform. The message is simple: we want stability, access, and continuity. How you run your country is your business. This is a fundamental departure from how the United States has historically operated in the region. American engagement often comes with ideological baggage, conditional aid, and shifting priorities that change with every election cycle. China's outreach, by contrast, is institutional and multi-layered. It doesn't just run through foreign ministries or heads of state. Chinese officials engage with legislatures, political parties, regional governors, and municipal governments. Party-to-party exchanges run parallel to city-to-city partnerships. Parliamentary delegations visit Beijing. Local officials tour Chinese smart cities. This creates redundancy. If one administration turns cold, relationships continue through other channels. If a president leaves office, the infrastructure of cooperation remains intact. It's a form of influence that doesn't depend on personal relationships or political alignment. It's embedded in bureaucratic routine, technical cooperation, and institutional memory. Over time, working with China stops being a political decision. It becomes normal. And that normalization is where long-term influence takes root. Because once cooperation is routine, resistance becomes friction. And friction is politically costly. A narrative that China is trying to overthrow the US dollar. That yuan-denominated trade is about to replace the greenback and reshape global finance overnight. But that's not what's happening. What is happening is more subtle, more gradual, and, honestly, ultimately more sustainable. China isn't trying to destroy the dollar system. It's building redundancy around it. Trade settlements between China and Latin American countries are increasingly conducted in local currencies or yuan. Central banks across the region have signed currency swap agreements with the People's Bank of China, giving them access to yuan liquidity without needing dollars as an intermediary. This isn't ideological, it's practical. For countries that have seen financial access suddenly restricted due to sanctions, political disputes, or global market volatility, diversifying away from dollar dependence reduces vulnerability. It's a hedge, not a revolution. Meanwhile, Chinese financial institutions have tightened their risk controls. The era of massive sovereign loans is over. What's replacing it is targeted, commercially driven financing tied directly to trade flows, energy projects, and manufacturing ventures. Capital still moves, but it moves through narrower, more disciplined channels, and it moves in ways that reinforce economic integration rather than political leverage. The result is a gradual shift in financial dependencies. Companies trading with China rely less on dollar conversion. Central banks gain alternative liquidity sources. Chinese institutions reduce their exposure to a financial system that can be weaponized for political purposes. There's no announcement, no summit, no new Bretton Woods. Just incremental adjustments that, over time, create a parallel financial architecture. In an era where financial tools can be deployed as weapons overnight, redundancy is resilience. And resilience, in this case, favors Beijing. When you step back and look at the full picture, what emerges is not a series of isolated initiatives. It's an integrated model of influence that operates across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Trade provides the foundation. China absorbs a huge share of Latin America's mineral and agricultural exports. It sources nearly all its lithium from the region. These aren't transactions, they're dependencies. Industrial cooperation reinforces that foundation. Electric vehicle plants, battery factories, telecommunications networks, and energy systems link local industries directly into Chinese production chains. Once built, they're expensive to replace. Financial mechanisms stabilize the structure. Currency swaps, local currency settlements, and commercial lending reduce reliance on the dollar and increase resistance to external shocks. And security cooperation, though less visible, is expanding. Training programs, disaster relief coordination, peacekeeping participation, and defense exchanges are all growing, often without the political conditions that come with Western partnerships. What defines this model is how alignment develops. Governments aren't asked to make public declarations of loyalty. Instead, ministries, regulators, companies, and institutions begin operating within shared systems. Once that happens, disengagement becomes economically painful, operationally disruptive, and politically unpopular. This is where the contrast with the United States becomes stark. American policy in Latin America often focuses on blocking individual Chinese projects. A port here, a telecom contract there. Each intervention is reactive, isolated, and framed as a security concern. China, meanwhile, is building environments. Environments don't require enforcement. They sustain themselves. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Latin America isn't making a binary choice between Beijing and Washington. It's selecting mechanisms that reduce vulnerability, support growth, and offer continuity. And right now, China is the one offering those mechanisms with fewer conditions, more consistency, and longer time horizons. Beijing has adapted to this reality with precision. It doesn't demand exclusive partnerships. It doesn't ask countries to pick sides. It just builds systems that make working with China easier, cheaper, and more reliable than the alternatives. And once those systems are in place, influence doesn't need to be asserted, it's already embedded. The United States, meanwhile, continues to respond to individual developments. A loan here, a project there, while a larger, more durable structure consolidates beyond its reach. This isn't a failure of intelligence, it's a failure of strategy. Because in the 21st century, influence isn't built through declarations of alliance or military pacts. It's built through integration, through trade routes and supply chains, through technical standards and digital infrastructure, through financial redundancy and institutional continuity. China understands this, and it's acting on it every single day in every corner of Latin America, without fanfare, without headlines, and without the need for anyone's permission. So here's the question we're left with. Can the United States recognize this shift before it's too late? Or will Washington keep focusing on stopping individual projects while China quietly builds an economic architecture that makes resistance too costly to sustain? Because this isn't about loans anymore. It's not about infrastructure you can see from space. It's about the invisible systems that economies depend on. The standards, the networks, the supply chains, the financial plumbing. And once those are in place, influence doesn't need enforcement. It becomes gravity. Beijing isn't trying to conquer Latin America. It's making sure that when the region looks for partners, China is already embedded in the answer. Not as an outsider, but as part of the system itself. That's not just smart strategy. It's a redefinition of how power works in the modern world. And it's happening right now, in America's backyard, while most of the world isn't even watching. If this story opened your eyes, share it, because the most dangerous strategies are the ones we never see coming.